I'm delighted to be here and very honored to be here with Dr. Eleanor Maccoby, a psychologist who really needs no introduction. When I was preparing to do this interview, I thought back to a slogan of an ad campaign that I remember in the 1960s when Eleanor herself was beginning to be the famous psychologist that she is now. It was a campaign for a fur coat company, and it said, "What becomes a legend most?" Now, Eleanor may not have a fur coat, living in California for much of her life, but she certainly is the stuff of which legends are made, and I look forward to talking to her in the time that comes. Anyone who knows anything about developmental psychology or gender or socialization knows the name and the work of Eleanor Maccoby. She has for decades been in the forefront of work on sex differences, assessing the claims that are made about differences and putting a rigorous scrutiny to those claims, assessing what's true or what might not be true. At the same time, she has had a long career of interest in socialization and doing innovative work in observing and trying to understand the interactions between parents and children and among children themselves. Like Eleanor herself, this work continues to be significant, continues to make contributions, and reflects a formidable energy that Eleanor Maccoby has. Not surprisingly, she has been the recipient of many awards and honors over her career. To sample a few of these, she was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, to the Institute of Medicine, and to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She received awards for distinguished scientific contribution from the American Educational Research Association, from the Society for Research in Child Development, and from the American Psychological Association. She received the Kurt Lewin Award from SPICY and the Gold Medal Award from the American Psychological Foundation. And a particularly fitting recognition, given the number of books that Eleanor has written and the impact that they have had, was the naming of the Eleanor Maccoby Book Award by the Developmental Psychology Division of APA. And, as a final note, not surprisingly, she has been the first in many things over the course of her career. Just to name a couple, she was the first woman to chair the Department of Psychology at Stanford University, and in a slight sartorial note, she was the first woman, as I understand, to wear a pantsuit to give a lecture at Stanford. We've come a long way in that. So I've had some fascinating conversations with Eleanor Maccoby over the past several months, and I'm delighted to be able to continue that conversation here today. So thank you very much, Eleanor, for taking part in this, and I look forward to our conversation.
Well, it's been wonderful to get a chance to be here with you and get reacquainted with you, and I feel honored to have been asked to do this.
Well, then let's start talking, and perhaps begin, if not with the beginning, but at least some of your early years and the questions of what got you interested in psychology in the first place. What role did your parents play, if any? Who were the significant figures that started you on this road?
I got interested in psychology in my sophomore year at Reed College in Oregon, and there was a gargantuan man who had been a football player and a prize fighter, weighed 300 pounds, who was our teacher. Monty Griffith was his name. And he was an iconoclast. He was very funny in his lectures, but what he did was destroy what he considered to be myths, one after another. One was astrology, and he told about the experiments where people were given this astrological reading for a given birth date. And then the experiment is that you tell them, "Oh, I'm so sorry, you have somebody else's horoscope, and here's your real one." And the point was that people would just buy into everything which was somebody else's horoscope, just thinking, of course this applies to me. So in those ways, he began to destroy one myth after another, including the belief in extrasensory perception. Well, I had grown up in a family where my parents, when I was about 10 or 11, joined the Theosophical Society, and they deeply believed in extrasensory perception, in astrology, in reincarnation even. I bought those things deeply, and one of the influences of my parents is to take ideas seriously. If you believe something, you live by it. We became vegetarian and so on. So when I went to Reed College and was disabused, it was a deeply disturbing experience for me. I went into a depression for the first and only time of my life. But I did buy the kind of psychology that Monty Griffith was teaching, and that was good old stimulus response associationist learning theory. His mentor was at the University of Washington, Edwin Guthrie, who I wanted to study with. And so after 2 years at Reed, I transferred up to the University of Washington and then entirely devoted my academic work to psychology from then on.
And how did you decide exactly what kind of psychologist you wanted to be? I mean, you got involved with the program at Washington, but of course over the years you've been exposed to not only the ESP at one end, but to later years, which we'll get to. At Harvard, you worked with Robert Sears, you had connections with Jerry Bruner, and a little bit of connection with B.F. Skinner. And from all of those, you've created your individual, I think, approach to psychology.
Well, it's hard to say what my individual approach is. It certainly is true that I bought into the zeitgeist of that time. When I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan, it was still the heartland of psychology was learning theory, which was based upon Hull and or Skinner, whichever one you bought. I didn't particularly like either one of them because I was still impregnated with Guthrie's research. I think I would have to consider myself a behaviorist of the hardcore side time until things began to be published that would shake one. I think the biggest thing that affected me was Chomsky's review of Skinner's book on language. And it was so devastating, the idea of thinking of language as a series of little responses which you could reinforce. It was so different from what is really true about what happens in development that I really began to question that. At Harvard, I was finishing up my PhD thesis work in Skinner's lab, but at that time the Department of Social Relations hired Robert Sears to come in and develop a program in developmental psychology. He decided that he wanted to study the effects of child rearing on how children were turning out. And he wanted to do what was then a very large sample, which was 400 families, where both fathers and mothers would be interviewed and to find out about their child rearing activities. And then the children, all 5 years old, would be observed and or at least tested in some way to determine certain things about their psychological character. So it was just one of those fortuitous things, because early in my career during World War II, I had been a member of the Division of Program Surveys in Agriculture, which is a crazy place for this group to be, but it hired a number of people who became later eminent psychologists, social psychologists mainly, and they did survey work through the war for any government agency that needed it done. I applied for that organization, and all I had was my little bachelor's degree from the University of Washington in psychology. But it was enough to get my foot in the door. And I just loved the kind of work that they were doing, and I learned how to create an interview schedule, how to determine, go out and field test it and see if it was getting the kind of answers we wanted and so on. How to create a sample. We were next door to the Bureau of Agricultural Economic Sampling section, so we depended upon them to get national samples. It was all very inventive and very new, actually. I also learned how to take the free answers to questions, and one of the innovations of that kind of work that was being done at the time was we were not using fixed answer questions, multiple choice. We were not using. Instead, we had focused questions, which nevertheless allowed the person to speak in their own words and give the answer that they wanted to give. Now, when you get data of that sort, what you're dealing with is transforming it into a set of scores or numbers. And what you have to do, which is what I learned how to do, is hire a group of coders and train them on how to analyze the free answer materials, and then you have to determine whether two coders are coding them the same way. You have to get reliability. So I learned a lot about what it means to get reliability in scoring materials of an open-ended sort. So when Bob Sears wanted to do a study of parent-child rearing, he needed to find somebody who would be willing to run the parent interviews, create them, supervise them, exactly, and see to it that the material could be coded. So yes, I knew how to do that, and I had just been trained in my PhD work in traditional psychology, which was a plus because Sears wanted that. Now, he also had had training in the traditional learning theories. His work originally was at Yale.
Obligatory at Yale.
Obligatory at Yale, exactly. But he was also deeply involved and believed in psychoanalytic theory. And his big interest was to see whether the two could be merged.
Now, this didn't become part of your modus operandi, I don't think.
Well, it did. It had to, because Bob Sears wanted to ask certain things in the parent interviews that I would not have asked. He wanted to focus on weaning and toilet training, for example, because those were supposed to be related to whether you would develop an oral or an anal personality, for example. I thought that I was very skeptical, but that was not up to me to decide what kind of hypotheses we had. So we did do the interviews, and we did collect quite a substantial body of data. While the interviewing of parents was going on, Bob Sears and his wife, Pat, were doing the analyses of the children's personalities or behavior. They did it all projectively by using a little toy dollhouse. And it had a little boy and a little girl, a mother and a father, a baby and a dog. And with that kind of a setup, you could see, for example, whether a little boy who was playing with these dolls, if the hypothesis was if his father had been severely punitive about this little boy's aggression as he grew older, then this child would displace his aggressive feelings. That is, he would pick up the little boy doll and have the little boy kick the baby or the dog. This was displacement. I might as well tell you right now that absolutely none of those hypotheses worked out. And the intention originally had been to publish connections between what the parents were doing and what the children were seen to be like in a totally independent measurement.
So you learned to be a developmental psychologist somewhat by accident or on-the-job training in any event, but it didn't necessarily mean that you adopted all the theoretical framework.
So what we did was to just write the book Patterns of Child Rearing based upon the parent interviews. But at the same time, Bob Sears was asked to come and be chair of the Department of Psychology at Stanford. So he left just at the time that we were beginning the analysis of the data, and he left all his courses to be taught. And the Department of Social Relations asked me if I would step in and do his courses until they could find a replacement. So I began to teach developmental psychology, which was a field I had never learned anything about. And there's nothing like teaching something in order to learn it.
That's an amazing set of circumstances that lead you, but you've said in some other conversations that accidents sometimes, or opportunities as well, account for development.
Right.
Yeah. One other thread I'd like to establish before we go on to some of your specific work. In reading your autobiography and other materials, it's clear that you had a social concern and political concerns from very early on in your life. In high school, you were actively involved with political issues. In Washington, when you got there, you were involved in a movement to integrate the cafeterias in the agriculture department. Where did this social activism come from, and also do you see it as linking with any of the work that you've done since?
Yes, I was powerfully affected politically in high school, because at that time I graduated from high school in 1934. So you can see that in those years it was the deep depths of the Depression. Roosevelt had been elected in 1932, and I think I just simply became a committed New Dealer. Everything that he thought should be changed and introduced, Social Security, workers' rights, and all these things. I actually, in high school, went down and picketed with the longshoremen, not to the pleasure of my father, who was a Republican. But I could say, imprinted, I think, at that time. And all the rest of my life have been concerned with social issues, and have, in the current time, I realize that one of the things, the heartland of this for me, is the belief that government is a good function, a good enterprise, and it is the arena, the way that we have for doing a lot of things in the interest of the general social good. I feel that focus has been drifting down over the long years of my life, but it nevertheless has been in my mind. I think I like doing and writing quite theoretical stuff, but I think almost everything that most of us do in developmental psychology we have in the back of our minds the expectation that this is going to be useful information for programs that try to improve the life situation of children.
Okay. Well, let's move to some of the actual work, because there is a lot of work that you've done. Let's start with perhaps the best known area in some respects, the work in gender, where you were really a pioneer. In 1966, which was very early on in the second wave, if you will, of studying gender, there was your edited book on the development of sex differences that assessed both theoretical and empirical work at that time in gender development. And then in 1974, of course, The Psychology of Sex Differences with Carol Jacklin, which became absolutely a landmark book, where you and Carol Jacklin assessed as best you could, and your best was very good, all of the work that was available on sex differences in boys and girls, between boys and girls, in all the behaviors that you could find, really. That book is really amazing. I mean, it continues to have a major impact today on research and theory. I just came across a description in an article last month that said it was one of the most comprehensive study of genders to date, and that's 40 years after it was published. And in looking at some citation materials, it appears that at the rate of something like 100 citations a month, this book is being cited here in 2013. So I guess one of the questions is, how did you come to get interested in the issues of gender? You really were at the forefront of thinking about gender as a good topic for psychology to get involved in. How did you get into it?
Well, all of us who are professional women at that time, in a sense, lived it. And we all got into situations, well, particularly I did when I was one of the few tenured women at Stanford, in trying to see to it that women who had been appointed to some sort of ancillary program, like being a lecturer or some kind of research associate, ancillary positions they were appointed to many times because their husbands were professors and publishing and so on. If you looked at some of these people, their backgrounds were fully as strong as their husbands were. They published a lot. They did a lot of teaching, but it wasn't paid for and it wasn't understood. So a group of us did get to work to try to see whether we could redress some of those things. The worst problems turned out to be in the medical school on that score. And so we did succeed in seeing that some people who were sidelined but were functioning like full-time regular faculty members got recognized for it. As you say, I did wear pants to teach in, where everyone else was wearing skirts. All the girls on campus were wearing skirts. They weren't allowed to come to class in, oh no, I'm thinking of the Harvard days, where the girls weren't allowed to come to class in anything except they wore the little pleated skirts, you know, and the twin sets.
And bobby socks, probably.
Yes, exactly. I also remember that when I was at Harvard, I was a member of the faculty club, but I wasn't allowed to walk in the front door. They had a side door for women and a separate dining room where the men faculty member could have lunch with their wives, or if there just happened to be a professional woman in their department, they could have lunch with her there too. I didn't become as outraged about that as I was in retrospect, and after I got to Stanford, I got more active, I think, in the ideas about women's liberation. Because mostly up to that time, I'd just been focused on the research I was doing, and I didn't think of it as being done by a woman or, sex,
Right.
gender didn't matter an awful lot. But it began to matter more as I sort of realized, was sort of taken up in the women's movement.
And you were instrumental in starting the establishment of the Center for Research on Women at Stanford
Yes,
back in the
indeed I
70s.
was.
Now, how did that interest in the sort of experience in living the political and the social aspects of it, how did you translate that or make the link then to the research, the books like The Psychology of Sex
I think
Differences?
the general interest in gender equality was felt by a number of national organizations, and one of them was the Social Science Research Council. They established a small working group on gender issues. And I was a member of that group, and there was an anthropologist in it, another psychologist, there was a sociologist, and we got to work over a period of a year or so and began the study. There were profound differences between Lawrence Kohlberg and Walter Mischel, who are both parts of this group. So in a way, I became editor of the book that came out from that. And their theoretical disagreements became, to me, more interesting even than the impact of the meaning of the whole thing with respect to gender issues. But in that book, we did a very big set of little descriptions of individual research projects. We abstracted and published abstracts in the back part of the book of a lot of studies. So that was kind of a format that was in the back of my mind. And then in the early 70s, wasn't it? Wait a minute, yes, about 1970, when I was already at Stanford. A young woman walked into my office. This was Carol Jacklin. She wanted a postdoc with me. And so we started to talk about what she might be interested in doing. And she herself at that point was a very avid feminist and a very effective one, I think. And she picked up on the idea in that earlier book and said, there are so many things being said about women, and I was very conscious of this too. I just hated the fact that psychoanalysts were saying that women were innately passive, for example. And I knew it wasn't true.
It certainly wouldn't have applied to you, I don't think.
Hardly, nor to Carol herself, of course. So we talked more about the possibilities of what we could do, but I was a little worried about one thing, because I had a colleague who had been saying, if research turns up something that might discredit women, you should not publish it. And I disagreed strongly with that. I asked Carol what she thought about that. She said, the truth will make us free. And so I knew that we were on the same page, and I hired her. Now, Carol was a go-getter when it came to raising money. And so she was able to quickly get enough money for us to start this project, which involved hiring a group of abstractors, young people who would read widely in all the literature. I got on the phone and began to call up people who had done research where I knew they must have, their abstract or their paper would say they had equal numbers of male and female children in the study. They never reported anything about gender differences, but I knew they must have analyzed for it. So I would phone them and find out what they had discovered and so on. We added as much as we could about the silent, non-replication sorts of things that happen in the literature.
Right, the file doors and some of the problems that meta-analysis has dealt with since then, but you didn't have the advantage of those techniques.
That's right,
so
we didn't.
Was your own thing. Okay, in somewhat later, and about 15 years after that, you wrote a book called The Two Sexes, and you moved from a focus on sex differences per se to the broader questions of social development. And you begin by looking at what you call the two cultures of childhood, and you weave a sort of explanatory web of biological and social and cognitive factors to explain gender phenomena. And you go on to talk about the implications of these early experiences for later life, in fact. What were the major messages that you wanted readers to take from that book?
I think in order to understand how I got into that, I should tell you about one particular study that Carol and I did, where we brought, there were 92 little kids. They were all within a week or so of 33 months old, a little over 2.5. And we brought them in pairs, either two girls together in the big playroom, two boys, or a boy-girl pair. These are all children who had never met each other before. And we devised various kinds of things that might elicit kinds of behavior. For example, in one case, we brought in a very desirable toy, but only one. And so the question was how they would deal with the fact that girls were more likely to take turns, boys were more likely to do tug of war. You can imagine that. But to me, the thing that was so startling was how different the social behavior was in the mixed-sex pairs than in the same-sex pairs. The same-sex pair girls did quite a lot of talking, and they were the most active, social interactive group of any. The boy-boy pairs were also quite socially active, not as much as the girls, but their activities were different, and they were much more active physically, covering more space in the playroom and chasing each other, imitating each other, and very excited and enjoying the play for the most part. The girls, in the mixed-sex pairs, the girls tended to stand passively. Here's your big word, passive. Standing on the side and letting the boy go ahead and grab the toy if there was only one good one. The two kids did not talk together very much. They didn't look at each other very much. It was startling to me how different the behavior was depending upon the sex of the other child you're with. And this made me think much more about the importance of peer culture. And we started looking at what was happening in playgrounds as our longitudinal kids got into the preschool age. We watched them and watched them again when they were 6 years old. And we found that at 6 years, they were spending 90% of their time in same-sex playgroups, spontaneously. Huge amounts.
The work that you have done, the amount of observation and the descriptive detail that you've given us about interactions between kids is really impressive. And you've also, beyond gender and the boys and the girls and their cultures, you've also had a deep interest in the process of socialization of parents and children. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of that work? It's a theme, one of your very first papers was in socialization, issues like that, and a very recent chapter within the last 5 or 6 years was on issues of socialization. So it's been a theme throughout your work of looking at these kinds of interactions, particularly parent with children.
Yes. Well, this came out of a long argument that started, I think, with behavior genetics people and what they were claiming. Now, when was this? In the early 90s, actually. They began to claim that parents were having very little effect on kids because they did a behavioral genetics analysis where they would first compute comparing fraternal twins with identicals, for example, or using adoption kids. They said that suppose you found a characteristic like, they would use intelligence and find 0.50 or 0.55 weight for genetics. So they would come out with a statement, intelligence is 50% genetic. And then they would say, so the rest of it is environmental. And they had a statistical way of dividing shared environment effects with unshared environment effects. And they came out with the strong conclusion that most of the environmental effects are unshared, meaning that children in the same family aren't much affected by their parents' education, their parents' income, the nature of the community that they're growing up, their neighborhood, how dangerous it is. All these things, or whether the parents were depressed or alcoholic or something of that sort, couldn't matter because it wasn't making kids in the same household the same.
Right. But what you did was to look much more immediately at actual interactions of parents and children
That's
rather than
right.
this more abstract
Well, what
way
it
of...
made me interested in was how in the world do you discover, here they were saying, parents aren't really affecting kids. And they also made the second claim, kids are affecting parents, so that if you see parents playing with a child and you discover that they play more roughly with a little boy than they do with a little girl, which is true, is that because of the genetics of the father, or is it because the father has taught the little boy to like rough and tumble play? Does he play that way with the child because it's what the child likes? You can't tell what direction the causality is going in that situation. So we began to try to get a grip on that by observation of parent-child interactions. We were observing mothers and babies at age 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. And we were coding in high detail. Every 5 seconds we put down who was doing what to whom and what the affect was. And then we started analyzing the material by multiple regression, and we said, we're going to put in what happens at this moment, what the mother's doing, what the child is doing. Then we're going to put those in as predictors of what each is doing in the next 5 seconds. Well, of course, the person's own behavior is the biggest predictor, but in fact, we found that for the littlest babies, the mother wasn't having much influence. She wasn't changing the baby's behavior, she was adapting herself to the baby's mood or whatever. Mm-hmm. By age 1 year, it was very much more reciprocal. And we soon, however, became convinced that these time intervals are ridiculously short when it comes to understanding influence between a parent and child. We switched, and the next study was from 12 months to 18 months. And we watched the parent trying to get the child to do something, teach the child a little thing to do. And we found that some parents at time 1 were very heavily invested in doing that teaching. They were bringing the child back to doing it if their attention wandered and so on. And we found that 6 months later, the parents who had been very focused on teaching had children who were more willing to learn 6 months later. However, the children who were hard to get engaged in the task at the first period of time, at 12 months, who kept wandering away and resisting doing the thing. 6 months later, the mothers were less interested in teaching. They had sort of given up on trying to get this child into engagement with the task. So this is just an example of how we started to try to discover mutual influence, interaction, as being the root of socialization, right, not the imposition by parents on children.
Yeah, it's a fascinating line of research, I think, and one that we could probably talk about for a couple interviews, yes, all in themselves.
I've gone on too long.
No, it's fascinating work. But I do want to get to one other area of your work that I think maybe not as many people know about it, and that's the more recent work with divorce and custody issues, where you again have published books, and you again have a record of, in this case, collaborating with some lawyers, I believe,
yes,
to develop
right,
some of these
right,
policy-relevant kinds of...
Members of our law school, Walt and Robert Manukan, both were members of our law faculty, and I worked with each one of them. With Mike Walt, for 11 years, we taught a seminar, mostly to law students, but also there would be some students from anthropology, sociology, and psychology coming into that seminar. And I say for 11 years we taught that. We started out with a big range of issues of children in relation to the law. And so that covered delinquency, it covered adoption, you can imagine a whole series of things, but more and more we became focused on custody, divorce and custody. And that became my special interest. And then Robert Manukan, whose work is on conflict resolution. He thought, this is the perfect situation to study conflict resolution, about how people make the decision where the children are going to be, with whom. We took 1,100 families where they had just filed for divorce. We went to the courthouse to find out who had filed, and those were our sample. Bob was mainly interested in just the concurrent events that had to do with their decision-making about the child's custody. I was more interested in the longer-term effects. So we did a 3-year follow-up, and that was published in a separate book. But one of our major interests, and this brings me back to the fact that I have always had public policy issues in the back of my mind.
Yes.
At that time, California was struggling with whether to emphasize in divorce, legal decisions about divorce and custody, to push people toward joint custody. There was a movement to that effect, and it was partly pushed by fathers' rights groups. So one of the things we wanted to find out was, how did joint custody work? And with our sample size, 1,100 families is not an awful lot, because the majority don't go to joint custody, but it was enough so that we had a group to study. So I think of this work as just a continuation of work on socialization, parent-child interaction, but in a particular arena.
Right. You've certainly never shied away from difficult or ambitious studies in your career. It's quite impressive. Let me turn to some of the other sort of extracurricular, if you will, aspects of your life. Not totally, but I was struck. I heard this summer a program on NPR, and they asked all their listeners to call in and answer the question, do women have to sacrifice success in order to have a family? And of course, as you know, this is not a new question. This has been around as long as you have and as long as most of us have. Given your life experience, where you have a family, you have an amazing body of work, how do you answer this question? Do you have to sacrifice success in order to have a family? The answer seems to be no in your case.
Well, I think in my case it was because I had such a good head start. Our children arrived when we were older.
Yeah, you didn't get your PhD till you were 30, I believe.
Well, I was 33
33.
when I finished the work for the PhD, yes. So I was a latecomer into the field. I think the bottom line for me is that it works out well if you get yourself thoroughly established in your profession with a decent income and then have children. It simplifies life so enormously, particularly if you and your spouse are both firmly established. At Stanford, it was wonderful because we could build a house on the campus, and it was very easy to get home quickly. Now, I have to say, when the children were very small, I dropped to half-time work officially. I think I actually worked more than half-time.
I'm sure half-time work is very rarely half-time work.
I know. In any case, I did that and went home at noon, and I did that through until both of them, the youngest ones, were in school. And did that affect my career? I didn't publish anything during those first 4 years. And
but you certainly made up for it afterwards.
I did, but I don't. I can only say that I think I can see those kind of elements slowing somebody up and interfering with future developments of their careers. I don't want to do my own life as a kind of model, because there is a downside to postponing your child rearing so long. I think you get tired.
Yeah. Although you, Eleanor, don't seem to get tired very easily or very often in your life, so that may be, in theory, that's the case,
well,
but I'm not sure in practice.
After 2-year-olds, you
know. I've talked to many people in the field who speak of you in terms of your importance as a mentor in their lives, and who have used you as a model, the way you have gone about your work, the kinds of questions you've raised. Is this a role that you explicitly defined for yourself? Or
no,
were you an
think
accidental mentor in the way that you say many things were accidents?
Yes, more like that. I have really enjoyed my interaction with some of the wonderful students that I've had. and we've been in touch through their professional lives, several of them, quite a few. And I simply love to read an article by one of my farmer students and see what they're doing now. They occasionally come and visit me, even in the retirement home where I am now. But I think I wasn't thinking of myself as a role model. In fact, that word always bothered me, and I don't really know why. I kept thinking, I don't want to be a role model. Nobody needs to copy me. So I didn't think of myself as a mentor in that sense, but just simply doing the best that I could to help them develop their ideas.
Can you talk a little bit more about your life as an emeritus professor and the values that have kept you involved in psychology for so long?
Well, I haven't been involved in psychology, at least for the last 10 years, I would say, maybe a little longer. I don't read the journals anymore. And so that means I've just turned my interest to my original interest in public affairs and current events.
This is a confession, however, of a woman saying at 86 she stopped reading the journals. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. I was lucky in that I had some research money to carry over into my retirement. I retired officially in 1987 and actually did some of my most active work in the 10 years following that. That was when we were doing the divorce studies and dealing with the data. And my department was absolutely wonderful in letting me keep my office. I didn't do very much teaching, just the occasional lecture after I officially retired, but it was very active in research. So it was important to me, especially since my husband died in 1992, and at that time it was work that saved me, in a sense. I just turned to a complete focus on it. All I can say is, yes, I have enjoyed doing what I've been doing after retirement.
How do you see the field has changed I mean, you have a perspective on the field. Do you see the
gender studies?
Not just gender. I mean, if, you know, in terms of, it's not learning theory anymore. Gender is, people understand gender differently, certainly because of you. I mean, when you think of what, let's maybe just say what your impact on the field. Do you have a favorite study or a favorite body of work that you really are the most proud of, that you think is out there and you're very glad that it's out there?
Oh, I don't feel an awful lot of pride, partly because there's been such a rapid change, don't you think, in the social situation, the rapid increase in the number of unwed mothers, for example, meaning that the nature of the family unit has been changed a lot, which I attribute largely to economic changes, which means that men have a harder time getting jobs, especially minority men, poor men, and they're not a very good marriage partner if they can't bring anything into the household. I think that's a terrible thing. Right. And I feel that when I look at gender issues, I think it's still important for us to be concerned about the stereotypes that people have about women. They still need to be blown apart, and we need to fight them and let women, help women to do what their capacity really is. But I think that in addition to that, I feel that neither sex will do very well without the other. And I don't like what I see where so much in the way of family life now devolves upon women to do the leadership and also sometimes, many times, do the wage earning. And I feel, in other words, that we need to think more about the ways of keeping men in the picture because I think that's good for both sexes.
Are there ways, if you were starting out now to study some of the developmental and socialization questions that engaged you all along, where would you start now? What would you like to see people doing in terms of some of these issues you talked about, the changes in the family composition and the maybe different roles that men and women are playing? Is there some research you'd like to see someone doing to follow up on your...
Well, people are doing some of this work. I just heard something on TV the other night, a group of people who are working with male black high school boys. And dealing with them and trying to understand why it is so many of these kids are dropping out of school, not graduating from high school, not starting college, not finding a first job. And we know that that just derails them for a lifetime and derails their opportunity to be part of a functioning family. So I think that's a very good focus. That's not the only focus, but as far as socialization is concerned, I continue to think that people have to think bilaterally, interactively, reciprocally about what parenting is really like.
Right. Are there any studies that you've done that you think people didn't notice enough, that didn't get enough attention, and you would like, if you could, to tell them to start looking at them because there's some nuggets of
Well,
value
my favorite
there?
one, I suppose, is that one with the little 33 months olders, because that just blew my mind, that so much of what a little child does socially in play groups and in groups of any kind as they get older, how much of that is determined by gender. And it's something that is in contradistinction to our ethic of having always integrated schools with boys and girls both in the same schools. I do recognize there are some cases where you want to send a child to a single-sex school, but for the most part, this is our national ethic, that we treat boys and girls as similarly as we can as a society. And I believe that is important, and the question of how it integrates with child culture is a nexus of interest.
Are there some works that I didn't touch on in my questions that you think you would like
I think you've been very thorough.
Okay, well, let me then finally just, we haven't said exactly how old you were, although some references have been made to it. You are 96 now.
Yes, I am.
An amazing, this may be a role model. I don't know how many people can match you with that, but it's quite amazing, and it's been amazing for me to have the conversations I've had with you. But I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, what is it like to be 96?
Well, it's strange. I never expected to live this long. And I noticed that there's a kind of reorganization, a change, and a mix-up in one's concept of time, about the future and the past and so on. I wrote a little verse about this recently called The Elasticity of Time.
The elasticity, always writing. Would you read it for me?
I will, or I'll just tell it to you.
Okay.
My future has drawn closer in. My past is getting blurry. My daily pace is slowing down. But really, need I hurry? There's ample time for little things that must be done each day. My routines still will carry me along their plodding way. But stretching time to make some room for purpose-driven action, that's harder. And I spin my wheels trying for some traction. So, is there time to stretch my life, and what's more, do it well? Ah, only time can tell.
That's delightful. Thank you, Eleanor. It's been delightful, as I expected, and as I've come to realize from talking with you over email and phones and in person for the last few months. It's been a real treat for me, and thank you so much for participating in this, and I'm sure everyone who watches this video will be thankful as well.
Well, thank you, Kay. I've enjoyed it very much, and I've liked the opportunity of getting to know you again, because I think I